We're paying for as much as we can already. But just remember that the same money that is available to pay for drainage improvements and transportation improvements is the same pot of money that's available to pay for everything else, for police and fire protection, for park and recreational services, for planning, for everything else. So the competing needs for the available and limited resources that we have just justify that we, in order to do what we want to be able to do and what we're mandated to do in the stormwater area, is well beyond what we can do within our currently available resources. So that's why we turn to the voters to ask them for some additional resources in the form of general obligation bonds or in the form of stormwater utility fees to provide additional services to what we can just afford to out of our general resources. If none of the proposals pass, well, in the case of the general obligation bond programs, obviously we would just not be able to do the capital improvements that we know that we need to do. The general fund would be no better or worse off, really, except that the maintenance needs that the general fund is paying for in those areas would increase. In the case of the stormwater fee, the mandates that we are under to provide those water quality improvements and those service maintenance improvements that we know that we need to be doing would still be upon us. We still have to meet those mandates in some way. So we would have to make some very difficult decisions in the general fund to come up with millions of dollars more per year out of a general fund that's already inadequate to meet its expenditure needs, to shift some areas toward the stormwater area to meet those mandates that we have. So again, we have to make difficult choices between things like mowing parks or putting school resource officers into the schools and shift those resources to meeting the stormwater mandates. Unlike most cities in Oklahoma, and certainly in all the cities our size, the Norman City Charter requires that rate increases must be approved by a vote of the people. I think that makes us a little bit stronger from the standpoint that we have that additional guarantee that once the voters have approved the rates, they have to be used for what the voters approved them to be used for. That is a bedrock principle that's in place in Norman and has been for a very long time. It's a holistic approach. Fix what's broken, raise money so that you don't have to continue to get behind in the future, so that you can keep up, so that you can fix things as they occur. We know that things are going to break, okay? Every time it rains, new problems crop up in our stormwater system. We know this. It's just that we don't have the money to address them. What we would have if we have that stormwater utility fee is a better ability to address those problems as they come up so that we don't get 30, 40, 50 years behind again. There is a statute, the Oklahoma Bond Proceeds Act, that requires that when the voters approve general obligation bonds, the proceeds of those bonds can only be used by law for the things that the voters approved. So there's a law. It would be against the law for us to spend any of those general obligation bonds for anything other than what the voters said they wanted them to be used for. So in this case, we couldn't go out and use the voter-approved street bonds to pay the finance director's salary or to push school resource officers into the schools. They can only be used for those capital improvements. In the case of the stormwater utility fee, there would be a separately accounted for fund for the stormwater utility, similar as there is for the sewer utility or the water utility or the sanitation utility, and where those ratepayer funds are going and recorded into that fund by council policy and by ordinance. They could only be used for that purpose. And obviously the ratepayers who would be paying those fees would have a very legal backed call on the council if they tried to use those funds for anything other than what the voters had approved them to be used for. Yes, the bonds have a fixed term, and they are paying for projects that once you pay for the projects, that cost goes away. Once you've paid off the bonds, that cost goes away. So yes, it's a very fixed term, usually 20-year bonds, and usually a project that's going to take you 3 to 5 years to complete and 50-year useful life of the project once it has been completed. In the case of the stormwater utility fee or any of our utility fees, those are used mostly for the ongoing maintenance of those capital facilities that the voters have approved, and those needs go on forever. Once we have fixed the storm drainage system on Main Street, we move on and fix the storm drainage system on Boyd. And 50 years from now, we're going to have to replace those pipes that would have been 50 years old. And so it's an ongoing maintenance need that we have for all of our utilities that would be the same in our stormwater utility, just with the fee to pay for it. No, because the voters would have specifically said what the purpose is that they are approving the bonds to be issued for. And the uses of those bond proceeds could not be used for anything else other than what the voters approved them for. There's a state law called the Bond Proceeds Act that prohibits issuers like cities or school districts to have voter approval for one thing and then use the bond proceeds for something else. That is illegal. Actually, the historic purpose of the Bond Proceeds Act is specifically that. Some years ago, a school district had voter approval for bonds for one purpose and then tried to use them for something else. And that's why the Bond Issue Proceeds Act was approved by the legislature, outlawing that practice. So no, in many years, cities, school districts cannot do that. Whatever the voters approve is what has to be done. What the Constitution says is a maximum that interest rates can be, so they can't exceed that amount. But also under Oklahoma law, general obligation bonds have to be competitively bid. And in this case, the bid is awarded to the potential underwriter who offers the lowest interest rate. Market interest rates for general obligation bonds are very competitive. Usually, we would expect a city with our AA rating, in the current market environment, we should expect to have a 4%, 3.5%, something in that range, but certainly nothing close to 10% or 14%. And again, it's market-based. It will be competitively bid, and we cannot exceed 10%. We cannot exceed 14% for community development bonds, but based on current market conditions and our bond rating, we expect to be way below that, somewhere in the 4%, 3.5% range. In my time here, when market rates were higher, I think we had some bonds as high as about 6%, maybe 6.5%, but certainly nothing close to 10%. I would encourage voters to understand that there is, first, no limit on the capacity that the voters could approve for public utility or general purpose general obligation bonds. There are 2 or 3 areas that the state constitution allows cities to issue debt. One is with a 60% majority, which is unlimited, that voters can levy taxes upon themselves to issue debt for any general purposes with the 60% majority. In a second section of the Constitution, the voters can approve debt with a simple majority for what are called public utilities. And public utilities have been defined over years of court cases to basically be sewer, streets, buildings, but not stormwater. Then there is a third section of the Constitution that allows voters to approve general obligation bonds for community development or economic development purposes, one of which is specifically mentioned to be stormwater. That section of the Constitution, however, is limited to a limit of 5 mills of ad valorem taxes. So for stormwater purposes, basically the only thing that we can do with general obligation bonds is under that third section of the Constitution for community and economic development purposes, which is limited to 5 mills. The reason that I would say that voters should not think that they are limiting themselves on a capacity purpose is that for stormwater purposes, we're proposing to issue all the bonds that we could issue under that third section of the Constitution. There is no limit on what voters could approve for transportation purposes, such as is proposed in Proposition number 1. So it's not as if you're stealing capacity from stormwater for transportation purposes. It's 2 sections of the law that are separate and apart. I'm very concerned about this discussion in the public about, shifting purposes of what the bonds might be done. Again, not only would it make it illegal under the Bond Issue Proceeds Act and under the Oklahoma Constitution, but I, as the city's finance director and the city's debt administrator, take it personally. I think it's personally offensive and an affront to my ethics personally and professionally to say that if the voters say they want to do something for this, that I would or that the council would allow it to be done for something else. That is just immoral, in my opinion, and it would not be done, has not been done, and cannot be legally done. It will not be done.